Good morning, folks. If you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. We're gonna wait just a few minutes to let others to join us as well. Again, good morning, folks. If you're just joining us, we're gonna give others maybe just one more minute to also join us, and we will start the our morning scoop this morning at 8:01 in the morning. All right, I think we are going to start. Again, good morning, everybody. Thank you for spending your early morning with us. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the associate publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times. The Arizona Capital Times, of course, covers state government and state politics, and we've been around since before statehood. Um, Earlier this year, Republican legislators sponsored a proposal to prohibit transgender women from participating in women interscholastic or intramural sports. The proposal is about one of many issues dealing with sex, gender identity, equality, religion, and free speech in the last several years. Transgender issues are difficult subjects, all the more reason for us to engage in civic dialogue and respectful conversation. But before we delve into the subject, I want to thank our sponsor this morning for sponsoring this forum. The Arizona State University's School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership is a new type of school, one that challenges its students to study classic works and prepares them to become a leader ready to take on 21st century issues. Established in 2017, the school combines a classical liberal arts curriculum with intensive learning experiences that include study abroad programs, professional internships, and leadership opportunities. The students graduate ready for careers in government, law, business, and civil society. I want to ask, and here with us to welcome us this morning is Paul Caris, who is the founding director of the school. For nearly 2 decades, Paul was a professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado, where he co-founded an honors program blending liberal arts education and leadership education. He is author of 2 books on the origins of a powerful judiciary in the American constitutional system and on the idea of moderation or avoiding extremes in American political thought. He is co-editor of 3 other books on George Washington, American constitutionalism, and American grand strategy. He has held fellowships at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, at Harvard University, at the University of Delhi in India, and at the James Madison Program at Princeton University. He serves on the advisory board of the program on the public discourse at University of Carolina, Chapel Hill. Paul?
Thank you very much, Luigi, and thanks to everyone who's joining us this morning. Thanks also to our 4 expert panelists who will have a conversation this morning. We're grateful for this partnership with the Arizona Capital Times to promote civil discourse, a mission we share. We have an annual speaker series called the Civic Discourse Project, now in its 4th year. You can find all of the archived videos of those speaker events. Many of them are dialogue and debate events, panel events like this. That's at our website, scetl.asu.edu. Just say our theme for this fall and into the spring is race, justice, and leadership in America. And our next event is a discussion of Frederick Douglass on questions of race and justice. That's October 26th. So thanks very much to all of you for being here. I look forward to a great conversation. Thank you, Luigi.
Thank you, Paul. We have a great panel this morning. Joining us is Caitlin Breedlove, who is the board president of Equality Arizona, a group whose mission is to build a strong and resilient LGBTQ social movement and culture in Arizona by increasing access to safety, well-being, and inclusion in society. Caitlin has been organizing and building movements in red states, working across race, class, culture, gender, sexuality, and faith since 2003. She is the Deputy Executive Director of Organizational Advancement at Women's March. She serves as the Vice President of Movement Leadership at Auburn University. And she is also a current board member and the former co-director of Southerners on New Ground, or SONG. Under Caitlin's co-leadership, SONG led campaigns, trained hundreds of new LGBTQ organizers in the South, built a membership of over 3,000 and became the largest LGBTQ organization in the South. Caitlin is the former campaign director of Standing on the Side of Love at the Unitarian Universalist Association. She's the host of the podcast Fortification, which interviews movement leaders and organizers about their spiritual lives. Caitlin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Representative Daniel Hernandez, who represents Legislative District 2 and serves on 2 House committees, the Committees on Public Safety and State and International Affairs. He's also chair and founding member of the LGBTQ caucus at the state capitol. He has received accolades for his work to find bipartisan solutions, including introducing a bipartisan resolution in recognition of Israel's Independence Day. And of course, exempting diapers, baby formula, and feminine hygiene products from sales taxes. He's a vocal supporter of reproductive rights and gun violence prevention. Additionally, he fought against legislation that would have made it more difficult for victims of sexual assault to pursue justice. As a first-generation college student, he was a congressional intern for the office of former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords of Arizona. And while assisting the Congresswoman with a constituent event in Tucson in 2011, Daniel took actions for which he is widely credited with saving the life of the Congresswoman following a shooting that injured Giffords and 18 other people. Representative Hernandez, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. The only correction I have is I'm one of the co-founders. I wasn't the only one that started the caucus. There was 4 of us.
Thank you for that correction. Thank you again. Representative John Kavanagh is also joining us this morning. He represents Legislative District 23, where he has been a resident for nearly 3 decades. He chairs the House Government Committee and serves on the Appropriations and Public Safety Committees of the Arizona House. John is a professor of criminal justice at Scottsdale Community College and recently retired as director of the college's Administration of Justice Studies and Forensic Science program. Prior to teaching at Scottsdale Community College, he taught at Arizona State University, and he also served as for 20 years as a police officer with the Port Authority of New York and the New Jersey Police Department. He retired as a detective sergeant. He is also a military veteran. He has served for 10 years in the Arizona House of Representatives, 4 years in the Arizona Senate, 6 years as a town councilman in Fountain Hills, and 3 years on the Lafayette, New Jersey Town Council. He was named Legislature of the Year twice by the Humane Society of the United States, and he is the chief sponsor of animal protection legislation in our state, including allowing people to break into overheated cars without liability to rescue kids and pets, and recently increasing the penalty for extreme cruelty to animals. He also wrote the law strengthening everyone's protection from vexatious and frivolous lawsuits. Representative Kavanagh, thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. And if nothing else, your viewers know that I'm addicted to low-paying elected positions.
Yes, you and Representative Hernandez. Also joining us is Professor Scott Yainer, who is a professor of political science at Boise State University, where he teaches political philosophy. He lives in Idaho with his wife, Amy, and his 5 children. He has published on a variety of subjects, including the Scottish Enlightenment, the philosophic status of revealed religion, American literature, and the family in modern political thought. He teaches subjects ranging from the American Revolution to the American founding, literature of World War I, Civil War and Reconstruction, and the Idea of America. He's a nationally renowned commentator and public thinker and has appeared on major news networks. Professor Yainer, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Again, to our audience, to our viewers and our listeners, thank you for spending your morning with us. We want to ask for you to send us your questions, in which you can do that by either sending questions via the chat box or via the Q&A box. We will try our best to get to as many of them toward the end of the program. So please do send in your questions. As I mentioned earlier, under the legislation sponsored by Republicans this year, an interscholastic or intramural athletics team or sport designated for females, women, or girls cannot be open to students who are born biologically male. And if disputed, for example, among the bill's provisions is that a student may establish the student's sex by presenting a signed physician statement indicating the student's sex based on an analysis of the student's genetic makeup. This proposal is likely going to be reintroduced again next year. Let me start with Representative Kavanagh. Kavanagh, you're a supporter of this legislation. Why do we need this in Arizona?
Well, when you get into issues of LGBTQ rights in general, like almost everything that comes before the legislature, it's a balancing of people's interests, concerns, and that's really what we're trying to do. With respect to the Bartow bill, we tried to draw a reasonable balance between transgender females who very often are still biologically male with all of the advantage of muscle mass and size, with those of biological females who play in school sports. And, it's not just, oh, let's go out and have a team and have fun. For many of these kids, especially those on the varsity teams, this is a big part of their life. They belong to club teams, they practice year round, they want the trophies, they want their team to win, they want the scholarships that go with athletic excellence in high school, and the same is true at the college level. So it's all about how do we accommodate the transgender student and let that student play, but at the same time, not destroying the competitive abilities of the biological females who in some cases cannot compete. We see this happening in Connecticut, where two transgender females, and I saw pictures of them, and they have a lot of muscle mass, are taking all the track records, they're winning all the track meets from the biological females. That's tragic, and that's terribly unfair and unjust. So I think you need to find a way to try to balance the interest of both, trying to be sensitive to both. I'm not trying to discriminate against people, but you need to allow biological females to compete in sports and not have all the trophies and awards taken away from them. I'm not 100% sure of the Bartow bills. I didn't write it. The idea about the examination for physical attributes is the right way to go. I personally would have gone with what the NCAA and the US Olympics Committee does. And they basically measure testosterone levels. It's not perfect because even a transgender female with low testosterone still has size and some residual muscle mass, but it's reasonably fair. So I have no problem with the transgender female competing in high school and college sports if they have their testosterone levels down to the level that the NCAA for colleges and the Olympics for Olympics sake. I mean, that's the way it's pretty much always been with those organizations. Because when your testosterone is suppressed to a certain level by a blood test, then most of that physical advantage is gone. And I'm willing to allow the small amount of residual advantage in the interest of inclusiveness.
Oh, let me go to Representative Hernandez. You oppose this legislation. Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, I'm disappointed, first of all, that Nancy Bartow is not here to defend her bill, which was a very poorly written attempt to try and have an election issue that wasn't about solving a problem in Arizona. And John, I'm disappointed that you're trying to Connecticut my Arizona. Oftentimes we're hearing from your side of the aisle, don't California my Arizona, and yet here we are talking about a Connecticut solution to an Arizona problem that doesn't exist.
Well,
What we saw when this was introduced was a failure from Republicans to be able to show an example in Arizona of where this is a problem. And that is because we have rules in place The AIA for over 10 years has had policies in place to be able to work with transgender students, their families, and their teams to be able to participate in team sports. So it hasn't been a problem in Arizona because we already have some of the best policies in place. This is big government overreach trying to tell folks, you know, we're gonna tell you who is allowed to play in your team sports here in your public schools. So while we are trying to make sure that we are protecting students, we are disproportionately affecting and impacting an already vulnerable population. About 2% of students in Arizona schools are identifying as transgender, and they're 37% more likely to consider suicide because of bullying and because of intimidation. So this is yet another example of us using a vulnerable population as a political pawn in a game that was just about a primary in LD15.
Well, first, let me just say that to ascribe motives to Representative Bartow as being political, I don't think is valid. I think she does it because she has a sincere belief about the issue. Concerning we don't have a problem in Arizona, well, the answer is yes, because at any time what happened in Connecticut could happen here. Because I've read the AIA policy and it is a joke. They do not require any kind of testosterone level testing. They do not require that.
Are you a physician?
What?
Or a scientist who has an understanding of what level of testosterone?
No, I rely on the NCAA and the U.S. Olympic Committee, which have solved this issue.
Again, this is not a problem in Arizona. And while I'm ascribing what I think is Ms. Bartow's motivation, she's not here to debate this.
Well,
so
I am, and it's not her motivation.
So,
but let me get back to the AIA.
The
AIA does not have any rule that would stop what happened in Connecticut. The AIA has no standards. The only thing the AIA says is that there has to be proof from parents and a doctor that the transgender athlete is sincere about being transgendered. There's no requirement that they be in any part of a transition process. All they're saying is, do you sincerely believe that? I do not doubt that those two rather muscular transgender athletes in Connecticut, I don't doubt that they are sincere. I believe they are. And if they were here under the AIA policy, they could play in Arizona.
So let me yeah. Thank you.
John,
I'm sorry,
Luigi,
Daniel.
Give me 1 quick second. I need to
just
respond.
one quick second. Just one quick second. Yes, go ahead.
Again, John, you didn't write this piece of legislation. That's why I wish we had the debate with the person that wrote this legislation, because as introduced, there were a lot of problems with it. And it wasn't until we pointed out some of the problems in the drafting of the legislation that it was changed. This bill is not ready for prime time. This isn't a problem that exists in Arizona. And having 2 anecdotes from Connecticut does not mean that we have data. Again,
would you agree that
Arizona problems need Arizona solutions, John.
Right, let me go to Professor Yenner. I'm sorry, John. Let me just go to Professor Yenner, and then we can flesh out the details of this bill. But Professor, is what you're seeing in Arizona happening? I'm presuming is happening elsewhere, but I want to get your thoughts on this, this debate that we're having this morning, and give us a bit of an overview of what's happening elsewhere in the country.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, I have a list up on my screen of about 70 male athletes, high school athletes competing in biologically male athletes competing in female sport. I mean, this hadn't happened yet in Idaho before we took action here in the state to protect fairness in women's sports. The way I would look at it is that if we can have a debate, I think, about whether we should have women's sports. But once we've decided we're going to have women's sports, that involves discrimination. It involves discriminating against men participating in women's sports. And there's a compelling reason for that. It's not only different hormonal composition of males and females, because sex goes all the way down to the cellular level. Women have different skeletal systems, different abilities of different amounts of power and locations of power. They have different susceptibility to injury. It goes all the way down to the cellular level. So even someone who's undergoing a kind of hormonal treatment to transition, as it's called, from one gender to another, the other kind of remnants of the biological differences between men and women remain. So, you know, I'm encouraged by Representative Hernandez's willingness to engage in the question of how we define sex, because I think that's a concession that we need to discriminate in order to maintain women's sports. And then it's just a question of what indicator are we going to use to identify the proper basis for discrimination.
Thank you, Professor. Caitlin, I want to get your thoughts, ma'am.
Yes, I would love to jump in here. So I am actually here as a mother, and we're 20 minutes into a debate about women and women's sports, and I'm the only woman actually in this conversation. I did not play a lot of sports as a kid because I wasn't very good, but I love the teamwork. I love the work we were able to do together. And for me, every single day, my concern about my 3-year-old is about the world that he's living in, went through a very hot summer, you know, inside a lot, very worried about how he's going to be socialized. I would love to have him in soccer, right? That's not the world we're living in right now. That's what I'm thinking about. Every single day, I work with thousands of other mothers that are extremely concerned about exactly what is going to happen with our kids. This is about children at the end of the day. I have friends and have been in relationship with transgender parents who have kids. And when I think about my child being turned away from children's sports in the world we're living in right now, it's embarrassing and shameful to me that this is the conversation we're having. And I understand that for a lot of people, transgender issues are brand new, but this affects a very small number of families. But for those families, it actually means the world. Given what transgender children are already going through in school, harassment, bullying, and then what every single child is going through, how can we actually sit and have a conversation that's about children and be talking about their bodies and how we will, you know, engage and think about like what is happening with their bodies. They want to play, they want to have fun. We're not talking about professional sports. And as Representative Hernandez already said, there already are rules about this. This is not a problem in Arizona. And I frankly think that as a voter, I want to see us being focused on the issues. And again, I understand that these issues are new for many people. I'm not dismissing that, but I'm saying that as a woman and as a parent and as a lifelong activist for other women, you know, every single day I think about women's rights. I would never want something that was bad for girls or women. I'm just saying all women and all girls should be able to play because it's actually what it's about, you guys. It's about playing. It's not about the issues that you're making this about. It's about socialization, playing, being in school, being together, and not being isolated and bullied for being children.
Nobody is denying any student the right to play. The issue is, do they play on the team that is more closely aligned to their biological self versus their psychological self? And I would be interested in asking Representative Hernandez and Ms. Breedlove, do you believe that the NCAA rule about testosterone, which is active in Arizona colleges, do you believe that that is wrong and should be changed?
I'm glad that you're asking about the NCAA, John, because what we saw when this bill passed in Idaho was the NCAA actually come out against this bill. So we saw on the record that the NCAA's position is to affirm people and to make sure that they are supporting transgender folks who are wanting to participate in sports. So you brought up the NCAA. So not only is this something that's discriminatory, it's wrong because it's discriminatory, but it's also bad for business. When we're looking at the state of Arizona, we know that our economy thrives on tourism. Right now during COVID, that's a little bit harder. But right now, Phoenix was just awarded an NCAA tournament. When we look at pieces of legislation like this, we see that the business community doesn't want to once again put a stain on the reputation of Arizona like we did when we passed SB, let me finish, John. When we passed SB 1070, we saw a steep decline in Arizona's attracting of conventions and conferences. Then in 2014, Governor Jan Brewer vetoed SB 1062, another discriminatory bill that almost cost us a Super Bowl. So when we're looking at this kind of legislation, when we discriminate, when we promote hate in the state of Arizona, it's not only bad morally, but it's bad for business. We had over 250 businesses, including one of the first businesses was the Arizona Diamondbacks. So when we're talking about sports, I'm going to trust that the Diamondbacks and the NCAA have better views of how to
The
talk about these
NCAA
sports.
has a testosterone level for college athletes. Do you
And they
support that
came
level?
out against this bill in Idaho,
Do
John.
you support
They came out
testosterone?
against this bill in
You have to
Idaho
answer the
because it
question,
was wrong.
Daniel. We're on a
John,
small screen. You can't escape. Is the NCAA discriminating against LGBTQ students in college by insisting on the testosterone test for sports?
John, again, the
You're not answering.
NCAA and the
I don't care
IOC
about the high
have
school. I'm asking
policies
you about the
that
college
affirm
standard.
trans athletes being able to participate in sports. The bill that
What
was
about
drafted and the
college?
bill that was introduced here in Arizona is one of a model piece of legislation that was
All right,
introduced
you're
in
not
26
answering.
states.
How
So
about Ms.
I
And
want to
only
ask,
one
where do you
state
stand
passed
on
it, and that was
NCAA?
Idaho. And the NCAA came out against this very
What about
type
the
of bill
college
in Idaho.
requirement, Daniel? Do you support the NCAA in its requiring a testosterone level to play at college?
I support parents, families, teachers, and educators coming up with policies to govern how kids should play
So you
sports.
oppose
so
the
let me
NCAA?
step in here for a moment,
AIA
and let's
You
go
won't
to
That's why
answer
the
the question.
AIA
This is
policies
ridiculous.
are
John
a gold
and
standard
Daniel.
across the country.
Let's have Ms.
Thank you.
Breedlove answer, or maybe she's more open to
All right,
being frank.
well, I actually want to ask Caitlin a question, and Caitlin, if you want to answer Representative Kavanagh's question, go ahead and do so. But during a committee hearing this year on this particular legislation, a female athlete recounted how her softball team lost to the opposing team because the latter has a transgender member. She said the transgender athlete, and I quote, gave them an edge both physically and mentally that we could not match. In other parts of the country, we've seen transgender women dominate women's sports. The question I want to ask you, Caitlin, is allowing transgender women to participate in this way, is this not unfair to women athletes? And again, if you want to answer Representative Kavanaugh's question directly, go ahead and do so.
The reason that I don't think it's unfair as a mom and as a parent is that these are incredibly individual and anecdotal situations. You can actually see in the chat and the conversation all of the different arguments that could be made and pulled out about ways that this is not discriminatory. Actually, we're in a moment in terms of what's happening with transgender rights in this country where, and I would not speak from that perspective because I think it's important to note, there isn't anyone transgender or the parent of a transgender child even on this panel. So it's important that I speak from the perspective I have and not from anyone's else, that I think that the really important issue here to understand is that these tests on other people's bodies that are being proposed by Representative Kavanagh and others, actually really lack an understanding of what's happening with transgender communities, bodies, science, genetic, testosterone. It feels like throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall in terms of a conversation about other people's bodies. And as a woman, that's what I find particularly invasive and offensive. As a mother, it horrifies me to think about my child being run through some invasive testing. That is traumatic and offensive. The fact is that when you look at professional athletes, there are differences beyond the spectrum of any definition of sex or gender that's happening in muscle mass, body weight, testosterone, estrogen. The point is that the invasion of privacy on individuals is actually more important to make sure that that doesn't happen than to have an anecdotal conversation about a team that lost, felt a certain way, and frankly was picked up by right-wing media to then extend and say this is an issue. Again, I want to go back to what Representative Hernandez said. This is not an issue in Arizona. And given what is on the table in this state, I understand that there are big concerns. But as a mother, frankly, I really want elected officials to take care of the critical things and spend their time, which is our taxpayer money, on unbelievably large crises that we face in this state and in this country. I would like to talk about climate change. I would like to talk about what's going to happen with public schools. I would like to talk about us not having childcare, right? That is safe and possible. I would like my elected officials to focus on those things.
This is
not
an
on-
issue.
I want to bring in, John, hold on a second, John.
Did
Hold on a
anybody
second.
answer the NCAA question? The Olympics do this? Are they racist? Are they doing invasive tests? They won't come down on the issue. Do you oppose the Olympics and the NCAA's rule for testosterone testing? That's a simple question, and you can't run from it.
So I want to actually bring in Professor Yainer. Sir, I want to ask you another question. But again, if you want to respond to Caitlin, Representative Hernandez, or Representative Kavanagh, go ahead. But we know that transgender individuals are marginalized members of our society. They experience bullying, harassment, family rejection. there was an American Academy of Pediatrics survey that shows that transgender adolescents reported an attempted suicide rate of half, 50.8%, 51%. And I wonder, is it not a small price to pay to let them play in any sport, in any category, male or female, to help them and integrate them into society so that they're not facing the same these health problems, these suicide problems that we are seeing?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very complicated question. I would go back and then let me try to come up to it. I mean, these laws do discriminate, right? The fact that we're protecting women's sports is a discriminatory act because they need it in order to have a sporting experience, which we all want them to be able to have. And there's a finite number of slots on teams. So just last week, the NCAA Division II school, Franklin Pierce University, was entered into an agreement with the Justice Department to stop allowing biologically male athletes to participate in their sports program. There was a male member of the track program at that school at Franklin Pierce in New Hampshire who transitioned to be a female and then won the national title in 2019 Division II in the 400-yard dash. Now, it's a real issue. You have moved someone off a team and you've changed the way that that the competition is structured. So it is a real issue, and it's not, and it is anecdotal. I mean, I've got 20 anecdotes or 70 anecdotes. I mean, every act of discrimination is to some extent anecdotal. So I think taking a proactive approach to protecting women's sports is a prudent thing to do given the trends in the country. And also the question of whether or not the NCAA's approach is legal from the standpoint of Title IX, whether it constitutes discrimination against women athletes, which is the claim that the Justice Department used to leverage Franklin Pierce into an agreement to end their previous practice. So I very, very much appreciate what is going on, which is that this is part of a larger policy debate about making society more affirming of people's asserted gender identities. And so on that, I think it's a very complicated question. The general approach is to say that you're either affirming or you're trying to convert someone. But all of these examples that you can give are show that binary needs to be gotten beyond. We need to get beyond the binary between affirming and converting. What about the young girl who's been sexually abused and doesn't feel comfortable in her body as a result? She tells that to a psychologist. And the psychologist, under many of the transgender approaches, must affirm and recommend that she transition from one gender to another. But that's not going to be what's best for that person. The same thing often happens with young boys in different kinds of circumstances. So it's not clear to me, the last point, and then I'll let others in, it's not clear that any of the studies that show that transgender Americans have higher suicide rates, that the reason for that is the phobia that they allegedly have to face every day. All social phenomenon are complex. There are more reasons than one. In fact, there are many internal reasons that people are upset and have a difficult time adjusting to the world around them. To say that it is only society's reaction, a risibly simplistic understanding of social causation.
So, Caitlin, I mean, you were shaking your head there for a couple seconds. Go ahead, ma'am.
Actually, I think the kind of non-factual mistruths that this professor just shared are actually incredibly harmful, especially the moment that we're in right now. We don't need fake news on this subject. It is.
Why don't you give me one of those, please?
I absolutely disagree. As someone who has worked with women and girls and is a woman, that this sort of idea that if you're sexually assaulted, you go to a psychologist and they suggest that you transition is a very strange mistruth. I have never heard of
You
that.
left out two facts there.
What we do know, sir, excuse me, I'm speaking. What we do know is that this conversation about asserted gender identity is not one that's acceptable from the experience of those who are transgender and live their actual lives every single day. So this conversation where there are a lot of opinions by people who frankly are not affected by these issues is really disturbing to me as a mom and as a woman. I think that when we actually think about the kind of tests that would be done, right, whether those are genetic or physical exams, there is absolute evidence that any kind of invasive physical testing of any form on genitals or any part of the body is very harmful for teenage girls, period. That's all girls. That includes transgender girls. It's not acceptable. And to suggest that there's a psychological problem, which is what you're suggesting, sir, with transgender people and children is incredibly false. The problem is with our society. And not accepting transgender people. It is not with transgender people. There is nothing wrong with transgender people intrinsically. And the suggestion of that underneath your comments is part of why we have such high suicide rates for transgender youth, why we have so much discrimination against transgender people in this country. And it's completely unacceptable to put that out in the public forum, just as I think disinformation and misinformation of all kinds are not acceptable when it comes to these issues, because so many people are talking about them for the first time. We have a responsibility to be honest about what we actually know about the impact for children. And these are children that we're talking about.
Professor
We're
Yenner,
not
I want
talking
to
about adults in professional sports. We're talking about children. And that's my biggest concern here, right? Is that you're actually discussing the psychological implications of these issues for children. And you're misconstruing facts on incredibly important topics like sexual assault, sexual harassment, and sexual violence of young people, period. People who are under 18.
Thank you, Caitlin. Professor Yenner, I want to give you the opportunity to respond, sir. Go ahead. Professor Yenner, I think you're muted, sir.
Yeah, I was looking for my unmute button.
Go ahead.
So I mean, I can kind of repeat what I said before. There is no social phenomenon in the history of humanity that you can trace to one cause. And the argument that Ms. Breedlove is making is that suicide is a simple social phenomenon that is traceable only to the idea that society doesn't affirm someone in that person's asserted identity. Now, that is never true of any social phenomenon. When you study suicide, you recognize that there are things in families, there are things in one's own makeup, there are things that society does, there are general principles of the society that all affect someone's mental health. And that mental health itself can be interpreted differently by different people. So the assertion that the only reason transgender or any person who is suffering from any kind of alleged discrimination is suffering from mental illness because of just one thing is obviously false. And anything that you say to the contrary is an attempt to obscure the issue and malign what anyone else says.
Let me go to Representative Kavanagh and then to Representative Hernandez. Representative Kavanagh, go ahead, sir.
Thank you. You know, we're never going to solve this issue or get to the bottom of it unless people want to address the questions. I had the exact same situation several years ago when we had the bill about you could only go to the public shower, the locker room or bathroom of your biological gender. The opponents of that bill only wanted to debate restrooms, where admittedly there's a lot more privacy with stalls and everything. Anytime the conversation went to, well, do you have a problem with a person who's outwardly biologically male, even though they're transgendered, being naked in a shower next to a 14-year-old girl or in a locker room? They would never, ever answer that question. They ran right to the bathroom where they were comfortable. And we have a parallel here. We have the inability to discuss a reasonable standard which the Olympic Committee and the NCAA uses. And it's not a horrible, invasive, psychologically scarring test. It's a blood test, like you get when you go for a physical. You know, and I'm saddened that we can't get to the bottom of this discussion. And I'm saddened that people are saying the NCAA is the answer when the NCAA has a policy which they, I assume, think is bad.
Representative Hernandez, go ahead, sir.
Again, Luigi, thank you so much for having this conversation. We have so many issues that we need to be discussing, and yet what we're doing here is wasting time once again, trying to put big government where it doesn't belong. When we're talking about kids in sports, we don't need John Kavanagh or Daniel Hernandez telling students and their families who should and who should not be allowed to play on sports teams. We have 8 million school children in the United States that play in sports in our schools, and yet we have 70 anecdotes. 70 anecdotes out of 8 million is not a data set. And as someone who's a researcher, I'm surprised that we're trying to use 70, which are, I'm assuming, spread throughout the country, and 2 that were in Connecticut, to decide what we're going to be doing in the state of Arizona. What we really need to be focusing in on is educating folks, because this can be scary if you don't know what this is. This can be something that is new to you. But for those who are living this experience, it is not new. It's something that they deal with every day. The discrimination, the hatred, the fear that trans people feel every day is something that is very real. That was one of the reasons why we co-founded the LGBTQ caucus. There wasn't a formal way for us as legislators to hear from these communities. And even now, we only have openly gay men in the legislature. We don't have any trans people. So in order to hear from folks, we need to bring them to the table and to bring them to share their experiences. That's why I actually sat down with John earlier last year after a comment that was offensive to one of our members and said, we want you to learn about what it means to be trans. And I hope that John will join us next year when it's safe to have that conversation with trans people, because that's what's missing here. Folks who can talk about that experience, because what we're doing here is talking about a genetic test or a blood test, and that wasn't what was in the bill. The bill was to discriminate trans kids from being able to participate in team sports, which we know helps not only with the mental health, but the academic progress and the future success of these students. Because not every kid is coming in wanting to be an Olympic athlete. A lot of kids want to participate because there's teamwork and there's an opportunity to have camaraderie and friendship, and that's built off of these team sports.
Let me ask a larger question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Caitlin, were you gonna say something real quick?
Respond to one thing that the professor said, that, I understand that I'm not an academic, but I have been a member of the LGBTQ community my whole adult life. I was a teenager that came out as a lesbian, but as importantly, I have worked with literally hundreds and thousands of LGBTQ people, including when I first started working in the community, always in red and purple states. So I can tell you that is a data set. And the thousands of stories that I heard again and again, the young people that I've worked with over the last 20 years were not considering suicide because of a whole bunch of other nameless factors in their life. That was not their lived experience of their life. And I'm a person that values people's lived experience of their life. Their experience was rejection by family, by church, by society, not being able to get a job, being openly discriminated and afraid for their lives every single day. They were very clear in their own stories and have been very clear that those were the factors for why they were considering suicide. Those were the factors for a lot of the other negative things that impact our community. So I would say that even my own struggles as a teenager, I was pretty clear that there wasn't something inside of me wrong, biological, oh, my mom or daddy, there was something that went terribly wrong. No, I'm proud of who I am. I know why it was difficult. Like every young person knows why it's difficult who is LGBTQ in this country. It's because there is systemic and structural discrimination against us when we're children. And I don't want that to happen to my child or anyone else's child, because I have seen things get a lot better for our community in certain ways over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And some things remain the same. And those are the kinds of issues where we have to have responsible, educated discussions, as Representative Hernandez said, where the community is really at the table saying what their experiences are, which should be true of absolutely any other community we're working with. You can't make decisions about people without them being at the table of their own lives.
So let me ask Professor Yaner. Professor Yaner, in one of your articles, you said that transgender activists seek to undermine parental rights. They seek to eliminate different ways boys and girls are socialized, so they will have very similar characters and temperaments, and that they seek to erase sexual taboos by embracing new ways for individuals to achieve sexual satisfaction outside of monogamous procreative marriage. help us understand why you think transgender activists, from your point of view, are undermining parental rights.
Well, I want to go back and come back forward again. So thank you, Caitlin, for sharing those anecdotes. I'm glad we can use anecdotes. I actually like to rely on data as well as anecdotes. So what I would do is compare countries that have a much longer history of accepting LGBT identities than America, and compare their suicide rates among those among LGBT people in their population to ours. And we see that places like Denmark, places like Holland, where same-sex marriage was legalized, 20 years earlier than America, have suicide rates similar to America among that community. And that's an important fact that shows that it's not simply the environment. No one denies that the environment affects someone's psychological health, but it's not only the environment that determines your psychological health. So thank you for that question, Luigi. I mean, the way I look at it is that there are certain circumstances that parents are put into where professionals, whether in schools or in the psychological community, foist a remedy onto the parent that the parent may not want to have for his or her child. So, I mean, an example that I gave before is, I mean, actually, we've seen plenty of examples of this. The first one that was that I talked about in that article that you're talking about is one from Canada, where parents were resisting the idea that their, I think it was 8-year-old child should be transitioned from one gender to another. And the court prevented the parents from having any kind of say in their child's disposition. So Caitlin talks a lot about, caring about parents caring about their children. And the framework in which the Americans understand that is often that parental rights is the way to go with that, by which I mean parents should have control over making final and important decisions over their kids' destiny. And it requires a legal framework to do that. And so there are elements or tendencies within the transgender movement that erode the ability of parents to do that. And those of us concerned about maintaining a kind of parental authority over children worry about that.
Professor, thank you, Professor Yenner. Representative Hernandez, I want to get your thoughts on this one, sir. The idea that transgender activists are seeking changes to our society that would undermine parental rights. Professor Yenner cited one example. What do you think, sir?
There's no nefarious trans or LGBTQ agenda here. The agenda of folks who are trying to protect kids is not one that's a secret. What we know here is that when we look at the trans kids that are being talked about in this piece of legislation, they're being targeted in a way that is unfair and in a way that could potentially be unconstitutional. A very similar law that was passed in Idaho was being stopped and is being currently examined for its constitutionality. So what we know is that there's this myth that's being created based out of fear, and a fear that comes from a lack of knowledge and understanding. It's dangerous, and it's also something that we can address by educating people. So passing this bill is, one, not going to address any issue other than to discriminate against kids who are trans, who are already disproportionately being discriminated against. And two, when we're looking at what happens in the state of Arizona, we're in the middle of a pandemic and our economy is hurting. And yet we're here arguing over whether or not we should have this bill be passed next year, when we know that a similar piece of legislation in Idaho caused the NCAA to come out against that bill, potentially costing them NCAA tournaments. And then when this bill passed, when a trans discriminatory bill passed in North Carolina a couple of years ago, it cost the state of Carolina $3.76 billion with a B. We had 250 businesses come out and say, this is not the kind of legislation that we need in Arizona. So here's the problem. We are talking about targeting trans kids who are already very vulnerable. We're talking about hurting the economy, and that's not Daniel Hernandez saying that we're going to hurt the economy. That's the Diamondbacks and 250 other businesses. And we also had the danger of losing our bid for the NCAA. So when we're talking about these things, we need to help educate my colleagues like Representative Kavanagh and make sure that we're not just taking 70 anecdotes and trying to use that as a data set to create policies and laws in Arizona when we don't have this problem in Arizona. When we talk to the AIA, they've had their policy for about a decade, and they've had less than 10 kids who are trans apply to play sports here in the state of Arizona.
Representative John Kavanagh, I want to pull you into the same question, sir. Your thoughts on the idea that transgender activists are undermining parental rights?
I'm not really sure what in what way. If you're talking about banning certain treatments or mandating treatments, I'm not sure what you're talking about.
So, for example, in Wisconsin, a school district policy instructs employees to assist children of any age to adopt a transgender identity at the school upon the child's request without notice or consent from parents. Examples like this.
I'm sorry, yeah, my phone rang and I missed that. Could you do it real quick?
Sure. In Wisconsin, for example, a school district policy instructs employees to assist children of any age to adopt a transgender identity at the school upon the child's request without notice to or consent from parents.
Yeah, I don't think any school should start messing around either trying to make a transgender student transgender or trying to convince a transgender student that they should be straight. That's not the business of school. We send our children to school to educate our children, not to play with their minds.
Let's talk very briefly about a recent court ruling. The U.S. Supreme Court, as you know, ruled in June to expand the civil rights anti-discrimination policies in the workplace to employees who are transgender or gay. First of all, I want to ask Representative Hernandez, what do you think of this ruling, and to what extent does it advance the cause of the LGBTQ community?
You know, thank you for bringing that up. This is not a partisan issue. For the last 3 years, I've been introducing a bipartisan piece of legislation that in the state of Arizona would create legal protections against discrimination against the LGBTQ community in housing, employment, and in public accommodations. What the Supreme Court did is it actually took care of the employment part. But in the state of Arizona, you can still be denied housing and you can still be denied public accommodations and access to businesses and anything else because of who you are and who you love. And I think that's a problem. So I'm going to keep fighting to make sure that we pass this non-discrimination bill, working with partners, both Republicans and Democrats, in the business community and in the activist community, to make sure that that happens. But what we saw the Supreme Court do in this recent decision was not create a special protection for the LGBTQ community. It gave us a level playing field so that no one can be targeted or discriminated against in employment. And that's what trans kids are asking for. They're asking for opportunities to play. So this kind of legislation, these kinds of attacks that are based in fear and in lack of understanding and in knowledge are not going to further anything other than political points scored at the cost of the most vulnerable kids in our state. And that's why, again, John, I respect you, and I hope that you'll join us next year when we have a conversation about what it means to be trans and bringing in folks who have that lived experience. But when we're talking about policies that we need for the state of Arizona, this just isn't it. We've yet to hear an example, and folks have had almost a year to talk about how this is a problem in Arizona, and what they talk about is hypotheticals. But every time I talk about a hypothetical situation, let's say about an issue like gun violence, oh no, that's a slippery slope. We don't want to do that. We don't want to overextend. You don't want to use an axe when you need a scalpel. And yet when my Republican colleagues do it, they get a pass, and it's, well, okay, there's this abstract idea because of a lawsuit that happened in Connecticut. So let's go ahead and hurry up and pass this legal discrimination, as Dr. Yainer said, that will cause problems because we will lose business. We will be able to not keep having a supportive and creative structure that is created by parents, teachers, and educators, like we currently have with the AIA.
Representative Kavanagh, I want to get your thoughts on the Supreme Court ruling, sir. And if you want to respond to Representative Hernandez, go ahead, sir.
Well, I am a man who believes in the rule of law, and when the Supreme Court rules, that's the end of it. So the anti-discrimination in employment is the law of the land, and it should be enforced. I fully support any court decision. Regarding expansion, I don't think it's fair to say Republicans or conservatives are dying to discriminate against LGBTQ people. That's simply not true. And just like in the case of sports, I think you have to have reasonable accommodations, but you just don't seem to get the accommodation from the other side. We're not saying that these kids can't play in sports. We're saying that you play on the team that more closely matches your biology, because sports is a physical thing. So a transgender student who's very much still male physically plays on the male team. We're not denying them that right. But to get back to your question, I think the same is true of a lot of these laws in general. I think you need to, if a gay person walks into a supermarket and has received service, that's terrible, that's wrong, right? But by the same token, if it's a cake decorating place or print shop, and they're being asked to use their skills to promote something which their religion says is wrong, I think you have to respect their religious belief. So, craft a law which respects people's true religious beliefs, and maybe we're down the road to some sort of reasonable accommodation. And one other quick comment. I vote on laws based upon the policy, whether it's good or bad. I don't go to the Chamber of Commerce and say, what is the economic effect? Because I don't believe in being extorted by outside groups to vote against what my constituents want, because they're threatening not to have a ball game or boycott us. SB 1070, which I was a co-sponsor of, was one of the most popular bills due to polling in Arizona history. Even the majority of Democrats at the time supported 1070. And they went through the same thing about boycotts and boycotts. I vote my conscience, I vote what's good for my constituents, and I don't let people from California or Oregon, business people, extort me by saying they're not going to come.
But John, here we are trying to use something that happened in Connecticut for Arizona. So I hear what you're saying about not being extorted, but yet here we are having this argument because of something that happened in Connecticut, not something that happened in Arizona.
Hey, since you jump back, could you answer the NCAA testosterone question?
John, again, we are not going to go down this rabbit hole of talking about hormones, because this is not what the bill was about. The original bill as introduced had tons of problems. The amended bill that was fixed still had lots of problems. So there is not a way to solve this issue right now that I think does justice to the fact that this was based to try and do something to have in a primary so that Nancy Bartow could use it against her opponent.
That's beyond anecdote. That's pure speculation.
So, Caitlin, I want to get your thoughts, ma'am. I guess the same question, and we only have just a couple of minutes, so go ahead.
Sure. I think a few things. I think one, that it's really important for us to remember that there's the religious arguments being made are very convenient for certain interests. I have deep religious beliefs around greed, right? And we deal with politics where billionaires are supported far more than, the 90% of us who are not in particular class brackets. Like it's all about whose religious beliefs around what. The thing that I think is very harmful about this conversation is that you're removing people's lived experience as LGBTQ people. And there are a lot of threads here of us as a community menacing, taking up too much space. When you say you don't want discrimination, we need to understand that historically in this country, isolation, exclusion, and segregation, segregation is a very important word here, are all forms of discrimination. They are structural, they are not anecdotal or individual in any way. And I think that what continuously happens in debates is that LGBTQ people, we are framed as predatory, infringing, somehow we're manipulating society, when in reality, if you really look at who we are and who our lives are, we are trying to live our lives without discrimination, safely, with the same kind of basic concerns that everyone has. And I think that the conversation and the way that, frankly, we've been politically scapegoated, not only in the last 4 years, but in the last 20, in the last 50. And frankly, to say that the implications of us having same-sex marriage then ends, you know, centuries of discrimination against my community is completely irresponsible. I also want to point out that there has been several moments in this conversation where we've actually just moved away from what would it feel like for a transgender young person to hear their rights being debated in this conversation. And I think that should matter, because I think that is about, you know, Representative Kavanagh talks about voting our conscience, but honestly, this just feels like a red herring bill to push up, I don't even know whose careers, or push down other people's careers, or impact elections. So I do think the economic implications are actually very important. As a voter, I think that they are. And as a mother, I think that they are, because this isn't the kind of bill that I want to see my electeds spending time on when there is no proof, as Representative Hernandez has said multiple times, that this is an issue in Arizona. I really actually, it gives me great moral and frankly religious questions about what electeds are spending their time doing if this is the conversation that some are initiating and some folks are forcing others to have among elected officials. When I see a state in complete crisis, we have a climate crisis in the state, we have educational crisis, we have economic crisis, and as a woman and as a mother, we have a huge childcare crisis.
Thank
What
you,
is
Caitlin.
expected of us is way too much, and that's what the conversation should be about. Our
Professor,
kids.
thank you, Caitlin. Professor Yainer, we're pretty much out of time, but go ahead, sir, your final thoughts.
Well, I think that the girls who have their sporting experiences compromised deserve a place at the table. And there's a lot of discussion about making sure that everyone listens to the trans athletes, and we can listen to the trans athletes. However, I've heard no discussion of where the girls having a compromised sporting experience, or maybe being denied a sporting experience, have a place in the table. It seems to me that the Arizona bill that is being described is a scalpel. It's an attempt to balance the interests of both groups as they are in this debate, and to mind them. But I just don't see any concern about the fate of the girl athletes from the other side on this. And you know, if it's pointing toward the abolition of girls' sports, I mean, that's, you know, something you guys want to debate, you can debate that. But, you know, in Idaho, where apparently we have suffered many difficulties because of these laws, we can't stop people from moving here. And, you know, we have so many people flooding into this state, and in part because of what the common sense balancing solutions that we have offered to these complex problems.
Thank you, Professor Yainer. We are out.
Luigi, can I say one quick thing? Because I don't
Just
want to
real
end
quick.
without trans girls are girls. So to completely exclude them from the conversation is also irresponsible. And I just wanted to make sure we ended on that.
Again, I want to thank Representative John Kavanagh, Representative Daniel Hernandez, Professor Scott Yainer, Caitlin Breedlove. Thank you for spending your morning with us. It's a difficult conversation, but I am glad that we can have a civic dialogue on issues such as this one. And Paul, I want to thank you again for helping to organize and sponsoring this morning scoop. I want to thank the Arizona State University School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. And to all our viewers and our listeners, thank you for spending the morning with us. And thank you for sending in your questions. I hope this discussion has helped. And with that, I want to say, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for participating.
Have a good one, Paul.
Thank you.
Bye, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Professor Yainer.
In January
Thank
See
you,
ya.
Scott.
or sooner.
Thank you, Luigi.
Thank you. See you all.